Ethan Morone had been reaching for his son's hand 1,000 times a day for 9 years. But the morning Cal let go in the middle of Main Street, the rancher felt the cold run up through his palm like he'd been holding fire and only just noticed how much it had burned. Across the rutted dirt of Calder Hollow's only intersection, a woman in a coat too large for her was sweeping at nothing with a stick she had picked up off the ground. She was moving in that careful way a person moves when they have been shouted at for a long time and have learned to stay in the corners of places. If you are listening tonight while a kettle ticks down or your hands are busy with something quiet, would you tell me in the comments where you are hearing this from? It is a comfort to me to know whose kitchen I am sitting beside. Cal crossed the road before Ethan knew he had decided to. He was 9, small for his age, and he wore his father's old felt hat down over his ears the way ranch boys do when the wind has got into the habit of biting. He stopped in front of the woman. He did not say a word. He held out the sleeve of his coat and waited. The woman looked at the hand. She looked up at the boy. Then she bent, almost imperceptibly, so her face was level with his, and she said only, "You shouldn't." "I know," Cal said, "but my mama told me it isn't a thing you should. It is just a thing you do." Ethan had been 2 steps behind. He saw his son's knuckles curl around a stranger's wrist, and he felt something in his chest start to come loose, like a stitch holding a held breath had finally given way. Calder Hollow sat in the bend of a river that had once been named for the man who ran the ferry, but had long since been called by the sound the ice made in spring, the slow cracking that wakes the cattle. The town had a feed store that smelled of molasses and old rope, a chapel with a bell rope nobody yanked anymore, a boarding house that smelled of boiled cabbage the year round, and a real estate office whose owner, Bram Kuiper, had of late developed an appetite for land that was not his. Bram had inherited his father's spread north of town and his father's habit of buying silence, which is a cousin to buying land, only quieter and a good deal more expensive. They did not go to the house. Cal brought her to the barn, because the barn was the place where Ethan had taught his son the things that were less lessons than rituals. The way you hold a halter so the horse knows you are not above him. The way you check a cinch with the back of your wrist, and not the palm, so you do not lose a thumb. The way you do not whistle a horse in from a field. You stand and let him find you, because trust is not a thing you call. It is a thing that comes home. Ethan set a basin of hot water on the hay bale, and the woman sat on it cautiously, like a person sitting on a borrowed chair. Her coat was what you could feel had outlived the person who first owned it. Her dress had been mended so many times it had begun to be more stitched than original cloth. Her hair was chestnut going gray, not from age, but from that kind of weather that pulls color out by the roots. Her name was Sienna Voss. She had been 4 days on the road from Crow Bend. In Crow Bend, she had been told by a man named Bram Kuiper that the cattle he had lent her against her labor were her responsibility if they sickened, that her wages were his to count or to withhold, and that if she left him what she carried with her was his own. She had left on a Tuesday morning when the fog was on the river and Bram was still asleep, and the gate did not creak the way he had said it would. She did not say any of that to Cal. She said, "Your father has the look of a man who is going to want an explanation." "He will not," Cal said. "He is going to want to know if you have eaten. That is different." Ethan felt that one land. He sank onto the bucket he used when he was cleaning tack, and he watched the boy, and he thought, "This child remembers. He means his mother. The thing I cannot stop carrying, he is deciding to give to someone else." When Ruth had been alive, the kitchen used to smell like potatoes and dill at 4 on a Tuesday, like flour on Saturdays, like the leather of the harness she polished on Sundays in the back pew of the chapel when the singing went on without her. Ruth had been 4 years dead, and the kitchen smelled like cold iron and feed sacks and his own sweat at the end of the day, and he had let it. Sienna ate a bowl of broth without comment. She held the spoon the way a person holds a thing they have not been allowed to hold in a while. When she set the bowl down, she said, "I will be out of your barn by morning. I am not trouble." "I know you are not trouble," Cal said. "We are not asking." In the loft above them, a single pigeon turned in its sleep and made the wood sigh. Ethan did not correct his son. He did not say the practical things a man has to say about who pays what, and what the neighbors will say, and what kind of man he was once, and what kind he is becoming. He sat on the bucket and watched the woman hold his son's hand the way his wife used to, and he felt the cold that had been in his palm for 9 years begin, very slowly, to be pressed warm by someone else's fingers. Cal went to bed in the house later on and never asked for permission. Ethan, who who had been talking to empty rooms for 4 years, found himself talking to a room with a person in it. In the morning, Sienna was still there. She had set the barn in order, fed the chickens, brushed down a horse whose name she must have asked the boy, because the horse only lowered his head to people who had set it right. Ethan stood in the doorway with his coffee cooling and understood that his son had done the thing he had not had the courage to do himself, which was to leave a door open in a town where almost every door was being quietly shut by Bram Kuiper. Within 3 days, the man heard about her. Word traveled in Calder Hollow the way water moved in old pipes, slow but reliable. Bram did not come himself that first week. He sent his foreman, a small dry man named Cull, who came into the feed store and adjusted his hat, and said loudly that there was a woman in town that had left a debt, and folks ought to know whose debt it was, and a good wife does not want her man's money walking out the gate, and a good wife does not walk out the gate. That is not how my mother would have put it, Cal said from behind a crate of salt blocks. Cole looked down at the boy and did not seem to know what to do with him. So he turned back to the storekeeper and said it again, louder, as if volume were the same thing as truth. Ethan's friend Jess Calloway, who ran the boarding house and had buried 2 husbands and not a single one of her children, came into the store while Cull was still talking. She put a hand on her hip and said, "Cull, you want to tell me whose money you are carrying, or are you just borrowing, mister?" Kuiper's voice again. The storekeeper, a man named Halloran who had been a deacon before his legs went bad, looked up from his ledger and said nothing, but his eyes went to the door and then to the boy and then back to his ledger, and his pen stopped moving. The dogs that night barked in 3 different directions, which is how the cattle learned that something has changed in the air, and Ethan, lying awake, listened and thought this was what it had once sounded like before his boy was born, when he and Ruth would lie in the dark and listen to nothing in particular and count it as company. On the Sunday, Sienna came to the chapel. She did not come up the aisle. She sat in the last pew and did not sing. She did, however, cry quietly and without explanation when the hymn was the one Ruth had cried to. After the service, Halloran did not greet her, but he did not refuse her coffee, and when she left he said to Ethan at the door, "She is not your trouble. She is your answer." Ethan had been told about Bram Kuiper's appetite. Bram had of late taken to buying farms quietly, by buying the mortgages that the bank had come to hold after the dry summers. He had bought the Sierra place and the Lynn place and the Odell place, and now the only farm not closing was Marone's. Bram had let it be known at the feed store that he meant to have it, and that what was standing between him and the deed was the loan Ruth had taken out against the barn addition in the spring Cal was born. Jess came to the house on Tuesday and sat at the kitchen table and poured a 1/4 inch of whiskey into her coffee without asking. "Whatever he is doing to you, he is doing to the tariff at the boarding house," she said. "I am putting 2 and 2 together because 2 and 2 has been making 4 for 40 years in this county, and you will have to forgive me for noticing. Bram's loan on the barn addition. The bank holding it. The bank being run by a man who plays pinochle with Bram on Fridays. Why would Sienna have anything to do with that?" Ethan said, though his hands had known before he did, the way hands know things. "Because she was the woman telling half the county that Bram had a list, and he had been working his way down it, and the last name on the list was yours, and Bram does not care for a woman with a witness still walking around." Ethan set the mug down. He looked at Jess. "Are you asking me to send her out?" he said. "I am asking you to count what you have left," Jess said. "If I send her out, Bram has his quiet. If I keep her, I have a fight I cannot afford." "He does not get his quiet," Ethan said, and it came out of him before he had decided it, the way it had come out of Cal when Cal had crossed the road. Jess smiled the way a woman who has outlived 2 husbands smiles when she sees a man make a mistake she respects. "I owed that to her since Crow Bend," she said. "Now you owe it to her, and to your boy." That night the wind moved off the river and into the willows, and the house made the sound a house makes when somebody inside it is deciding to stay. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed where Ruth had died, and he did not say a prayer, because his wife would not have approved of a prayer in a moment like this. She would have approved of a decision. "If you are still with me at the kitchen table, would you tell me in the comments what you would do in Ethan's place?" I am not asking what is right. I am asking what a person holds on to when the man on the other side is bigger than the man you are. In the morning, a letter came on the Marone kitchen table by way of the boy, who had taken to bringing the mail up himself since the weather had turned. The letter was from Bram Kuiper's lawyer, and it informed Ethan that the loan on the barn addition had changed hands, and the new holder intended to call the loan, and the equity was not sufficient to cover what was owing, and a foreclosure would proceed at the close of the season unless Ethan could satisfy the principal at the courthouse by the second Friday of next month. The amount named was a number that had no relation to what Ethan had borrowed. It was the kind of number that lets a man know another man has decided what your land is worth before you have decided it, and the deciding is the taking. Ethan set the letter down. He looked at the barn and the field and the house and the boy and the woman in the doorway with her mended hands, and he thought, this is what it feels like to step into a fight you have to lose to keep. Cal did not ask what the letter said. He said, she knows how to make rope. Ethan looked at his son. Rope, he said. She learned on the river, Cal said. She was the ferryman's daughter in Crow Bend before the ferry quit. She said she could mend what is broken if you let her show you. Ethan did not ask why his son had thought to ask her. He had learned in a week that Cal spoke to Sienna the way a boy speaks to a person he has decided to keep, which is a different thing from the way he speaks to a stranger. Sienna, at the barn, did not wait to be told what to do. She took the broken halter rope Cal had been carrying around, and she sat down on the hay bale and began. She had the way of looking at a broken thing the way a person looks at a thing that has been broken mostly before, which is to say with calm and without hope, and with the very particular attention that is given to a thing the hands remember, but the heart has not yet forgiven. She could fix a knot in any rope. She could braid a new eye around a thimble. She could take a cinch strap that had been cut by a horn and restitch it so the stitch was stronger than the leather. She could lay a splice in a hay line so a man could pull a mare out of a mud hole on faith alone. She did not say so. She said only, this one is going to take 3 hours, and she began. Ethan learned, in the days that followed, that Sienna's trade was stitching, and a stitch was what a person did when a thing had been broken so badly that simply tying it together was not enough, and the stitching had to be done with the understanding that the break would always be there. But the break did not have to be the truest thing about the thing. What do we do? Cal said that night. We go to the courthouse, Ethan said, and we bring everything we have, and we tell the truth, and the truth is what we have. Bram's truth or ours? Cal said. Ours, Ethan said. Papa, Cal said, could Bram know she was here? He could, Ethan said. Could Bram be the reason? He could, Ethan said. And that is the trouble and the reason at the same time. The boy thought about that. I will warm the truck in the morning, he said, the way a man says. I will carry what I can carry. Now Sienna did not go to the courthouse. That was the decision she made on her own, and Ethan did not ask her to make it. And when he thought about it later, he understood it had been the right one, because a woman who goes in front of a man who has been allowed to dispose of her puts her body back into his hands, even when the hands are not his own. She did, however, ride into town with them in the back of the wagon and wait at the livery while Ethan walked up the steps of the building where a man named Halloran, who had known Ethan's father, would hear the case, and where another man who had been drinking Bram Kuiper's port the previous Friday would sit at the bench beside him and not say a word, but would nudge him when it came time to nod. Ethan had not been in the courthouse since Ruth. He had not been a plaintiff since then and had not been a debtor since his own father. He was wearing his good coat, which Ruth had relined the year before she died, and a hat he had brushed while Cal was still asleep. And he had a paper that contained a tally of every sale and every loan and every mortgage the Morone farm had ever carried, because his father had the habit of keeping these things and Ethan had inherited not only the farm but the habit. And you do not thank your father for the habits you inherit until you are standing in front of a man who is in the process of taking the habit away. The case was called. Ethan set the tally on the bench. He said, the amount I am told is owed is not the amount that was lent. The amount that was lent was $640 in the year of my son. The amount being called is $1,240, and that is $1,000 of new debt that was never signed by Ethan Morone, and that I am not in any position, sir, to owe. The man on the bench did not know what to do with this. He looked at the bank man, who cleared his throat and said the bank could not be expected to keep track of every memo. Who can? Ethan said. I will tell you who. The man whose debt this now is. The man whose name is on the new note. The man who bought my loan 3 weeks after the lady who had been his worker walked out of his gate. The man whose name is Bram Kuiper. A sound went up from the back of the room that was half laugh and half spit. Bram's lawyer said, we deny that, and we asked the court to proceed. The man on the bench did not have a reason to deny a man he was having dinner with on Friday. That, in Calder Hollow, was how it had always been. The bench said, "Mr. Morone, you may testify as to the original note, and I will consider a postponement until such time as the holder of the note appears to verify the principle." Ethan walked out of the courthouse under an oak whose leaves had already begun to come down. Cal was sitting on the steps with Sienna, who had come up from the livery without being asked because she could read the courthouse from a road the way a person reads water from a shore. "Papa," Cal said. "What did he say?" "He said wait," Ethan said. "He said the man who bought my loan has to come and say what is owed. And that is a thing Mr. Bram Kuiper is not going to want to do." "Why not?" Cal said. "Because what he bought was not a loan," Ethan said. "What he bought was the right to be paid twice." The boy thought about that. "Papa," he said, "Mr. Bram is going to be angry." "He has been angry a long time," Ethan said. "Anger is not new. What is new is that he has to come out and be angry in front of people, and people, as a general thing, do not like to see a man angry with his mouth full of somebody else's money." The boy nodded, and Sienna put her hand on his shoulder without saying a word, and the hand was exactly the right weight, which is the thing you cannot teach a person, but a person can learn. I want to pause here at the kitchen table and tell you something I do not say often in the middle of a story, and that is that watching a good person do the right thing at a cost is what this channel is for. If this one has been landing for you, would you take a second and tap the like? And if you have not yet, would you consider subscribing? It is not a banner. It is just a hand reaching across a table. That night a man came to the Morone gate who was not Bram Kuiper's foreman and not Bram Kuiper's lawyer. He was an older man named Tobias Finn who had farmed east of the river and had sold his place to Bram under the kind of pressure that makes a man sign what he should not, and then not be able to sleep at night for what he signed. Tobias was carrying in his coat a metal box that had been his father's and his father's before him. "Ethan," Tobias said, "I have been wanting to do this since the spring, and I have been afraid to." "What is it?" Ethan said. "It is the original note," Tobias said. "The one you signed. The one that was made out for $640, and that Bram paid the bank to have transferred into his name, and then added the second part of the amount and never showed the page to a soul. I have taken the page from Bram's safe because the cabinet lock was never set, because the man is vain and he does not think there is a person in this county with the nerve to walk into his office." Ethan took the page. The page was exactly what his tally had said, exactly, and not a cent more, and not a cent had been added by Bram Kuiper's hand. "Why?" Ethan said. "Because my wife left me in the spring," Tobias said, and his voice was not a whisper, but it was the kind of low you use when a thing has been inside of you for a while. "She left because I sold the farm, and the farm was the thing my father had given me to hold for her, and I sold it because Bram had made it so I could not breathe. And I have been wanting to be the kind of man my wife would have stayed for, and this page is the first day of it." Ethan did not thank him. He said, "Tobias, sit down. Have a coffee. You have just given me the kind of help that has not gotten back. It has only gotten forward." In the morning Ethan set the page on the bench beside the tally, and Bram Kuiper, having been served in the night by a constable who had not been paid by Bram in 3 months, came into the room in a coat he had not brushed and a hat he had not worn in public in 20 years. He did not say a word for the first half hour. When he did speak, he said to the bench, "I do not know what is meant by my name being on this. There may be confusion." "Mr. Kuiper," the bench said, "would you look at this page and tell the court whether the second part of the principle was written by your hand?" Bram looked at it. He looked at it for a while. "It may be," he said. "Then we will proceed," the bench said. "And we will note that Mr. Marone's loan was for $640, and we will proceed accordingly. And we will thank Mr. Finn for the page and note in the record that he came to it in the regular way." It was not a victory. It was the kind of thing in a town where a man had been quietly buying the whole valley that happens when one more person decides to be the person whose hand does not shake when the paper is passed. Ethan went out of the courthouse under the same oak. Cal was not on the steps. Cal was at the wagon with Sienna, and she had his hand in hers, and he had his hat pushed back on his head, and he was laughing the way a boy laughs when the thing he has been holding a long time in his chest has just been let go. Ethan did not go to them first. He went to Halloran in the feed store and shook the man's hand and said, "You did not say anything." "I did not need to," Halloran said. "You needed me to say nothing." For what? Ethan said. For the sitting down and the not getting up, Halloran said. For the coffee on Sunday. For the not being the man who looked away. Ethan went home and unhitched the wagon and stood at the barn and listened to the pigeon in the loft make the same would sigh. And the sound was the sound of his own hand finally letting go of the rope he had been holding since Ruth. Sienna set a cup of coffee at the barn rail. She did not say a word. She set it down, and she stood, and she smiled. And the smile was the kind of smile a person has when a thing they have been bracing against for a long time has just been stood down. They did not speak the rest of that day. They worked, and the work was the kind of work a person does when there is, at last, a tomorrow. In the week that followed, Bram Kuiper sold the Lynn place back to the Lynn boy at a price that was not the price he had set. He sold the Odell place back to Odell, and Odell told him at the closing that he would not buy a bottle of his whiskey again. He did not sell the Syrah place, because Syrah had died in the spring, and the land was bramble now, and Bram Kuiper's appetite lost the small sound it had once made in the feed store when he came in, and the men did not greet him the way they used to. He did not come to the Morone Ranch. He did not have to be told not to. He understood that the Morone Ranch was the first place where a man had looked at him across a ledge of papers and had said, in the way of a man whose hands are still steady, what is owed and what is not. Sienna did not move into the house. She moved into the spare room above the kitchen, the room Ruth had used for canning in the summer, the room that smelled of cedar even now. Cal had dragged a cot up the stairs without being asked, and Cal had hung the photograph of Ruth on the wall where she had always been, and Sienna did not move the photograph. She put her things in the dresser beneath it, and she said to it every night, in a voice that was almost too low to hear, I will take good care of him. Ethan heard her once. He set his coffee down on the counter, and his hand went to his mouth, and he did not go in. In the second week, there was the matter of the rest. Bram Kuiper's loans had been called in 2 other places, and a third was being looked at by a man in the county seat, whose name was not Bram's. 2 of the men had been told the same thing Tobias Finn had been told, that the second part of the principal had been written into the note by a person whose name was not the original lender, and that they could not be bound to it. The men did not fight for the page because the page had already been seen. That is how Bram's appetite ended in Calder Hollow. Not with a fight. With a page that had been seen by too many people for a man to keep it under a hat. In the 3rd week, Sienna mended Cal's good coat, and did not tell Ethan's son that his mother had mended the same coat the year before Cal was born, in the same place, with the same stitch. Cal found out by himself when he was trying the coat on, and he noticed, on the inside, the small difference in the way the fabric was being held. He came out of his room and stood in the doorway. He did not say a word. He just looked at Ethan and Sienna, and then looked at the photograph, and then sat at the table and ate his supper, and the supper was the first one in 4 years that had been made by a person other than himself. Papa, Cal said that night, I want to ask her to stay. Papa can ask, Ethan said. But the asking is hers. The staying is hers. You do not keep a person who has a say in whether they are kept. Okay, Cal said. Then will Papa ask? Papa will, Ethan said, and the asking was a thing he did in the morning at the kitchen table, which is the table Ruth had built him, and which had a chip at the corner, where Cal had fallen and Ruth had cried, and Ethan had held them both, and said the table would outlast them all. In the morning he set the coffee at her place, and he sat across from her, and he did not say anything for a while. And then he said, Sienna, Cal wants you to stay. I want you to stay. The house wants you to stay. The land wants you to stay. The photograph of Ruth wants you to stay, and you do not know what that means unless you have been in a kitchen with a photograph on the wall that is keeping the room warm. Sienna did not look up. She set her hand on the table, and Ethan set his hand next to hers, and they sat that way for a while. And the sitting was the answer, and the sitting was the staying, and the sitting was the kitchen finding out what the kitchen had been missing for 4 years. In the spring the hay came up good. In the spring the mare foaled, and the foal was a sorrel with a star. In the spring the river came down fast, and took out the causeway for a week, and the town helped one another across, and Bram Kuiper did not help, and was not asked. In the spring Cal learned to braid a splice in a hay line the way Sienna had taught him, and the splice was so good that Halloran offered Cal $1 for it, and Cal said the splice was for the Morone hay line and not for sale. In the spring Sienna and Ethan stood at the kitchen window and watched the boy in the field, and she asked if Ruth had liked the spring, and he said she had liked it the way she liked every season, which was to say badly and completely, which is the only way a person loves a thing for a long time. Stay, he said. I'm here, she said. That was enough. That was more than enough. If you stayed with me through this story at the kitchen table, the next story is about a woman who came back to the town that had drummed her out when she was a girl to take care of the man who had drummed her out because he had no one left, and because she had been raised by a woman who had told her that the size of a person's forgiveness is a thing that grows until it can hold what it was afraid of. I will be there with the kettle on. Good night, friend. Good night.